Imagine a scenario where um, the world's premier intelligence agency just intentionally turns a blind eye to like 93% of the global heroin supply.
Right.
And they do it simply to maintain geopolitical leverage over a local adversary. I mean, it sounds like the plot of a paranoid geopolitical thriller.
It really does. But according to our source material today, it's actually a documented historical reality.
Yeah, and that brings us to our mission for this deep dive. We are unpacking the hidden inner workings of U.S. foreign policy and the intelligence community.
Specifically focusing on how decisions are actually made behind closed doors, regarding the current conflict with Iran.
Exactly. Our source today is a heavily detailed, really provocative interview transcript featuring ex-CIA officer John Kiriakou.
It's a fascinating look at the contrast between the public perception of this, like, hyper-competent intelligence apparatus and the deeply compromised reality on the ground.
Now, before we get into the weeds here, I want to clearly state to you listening that this source contains some highly charged political claims.
Very charged, spanning the entire ideological spectrum.
Right, so neither of us are here to endorse these viewpoints, take a side, or verify them as absolute truth. We're just acting as your guides to map out the arguments presented.
Unpacking what happens when the intelligence community's priorities completely detach from the public interest.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start by looking at how a superpower actually enters a conflict, right?
Right, the mechanics of it. Kiriakou points to the immediate crisis with Iran and contrasts the current unilateral approach with the historical playbook.
Because it used to be so different.
Completely different. Previous administrations, like George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, used a formal process called burden sharing.
And burden sharing wasn't just some diplomatic buzzword. It's like planning a massive group road trip. You don't just suddenly start driving without telling the people who are paying for the gas.
That's a great analogy. The U.S. didn't just launch an overseas military operation and hand the invoice to the American taxpayer. They gathered national intelligence estimates, consulted the State Department.
Yeah, and defense departments, yeah.
Right. And fundamentally, they crowdfunded the conflict. Like in the 1990 Gulf War, Kuwait's investments effectively financed the liberation of its own country.
European allies absorbed massive logistical costs. I mean, it required meticulous diplomatic groundwork before a single troop moved.
But according to the source, that diplomatic groundwork is completely absent in the current Iran conflict. Traditional allies were kept entirely in the dark.
The only apparent consultation was with Israel.
Right. And the downstream effect of ignoring your allies isn't just, ruffled feathers at the UN. It creates immediate, tangible domestic crises for those allies.
Yeah, Kiriakou illustrates this with a startling anecdote. He talks about being stuck in Ireland, warned by his hotel to leave for the airport hours early.
Because the country was engulfed in the largest protest in its history.
Exactly. And they weren't protesting abstract foreign policy. They were protesting the sudden, brutal economic shockwave of U.S. unilateral action.
Because when you cut off global supply chains overnight without warning your coalition partners, they have zero time to implement a plan B.
Which meant home heating oil shortages and gasoline rocketing to $12.50 a gallon.
Just across Europe. Imagine dealing with that overnight.
It's nuts. If you force your oldest allies to bear the brunt of your geopolitical surprise parties, you fundamentally fracture the foundation of those alliances.
You're demanding loyalty while actively destroying their domestic economy.
So if the traditional coalition, the Brits, the Canadians, the Europeans, are completely out of the loop, who is actually steering the policy?
Well, the source argues the driver is no longer broad American strategic interests, but specifically Israeli interests.
Centered around one heavily contested justification, right? The Iranian nuclear threat.
Exactly. And this represents a profound inversion of the historical hierarchy. During the 1990 and 2003 Gulf Wars, the U.S. frequently pushed back against Israeli demands.
Because they conflicted with broader American goals.
Right. But the source asserts that today, that dynamic has flipped, prioritizing a foreign nation's immediate security goals over American stability.
And the central pillar justifying all this is the claim that Iran is on the precipice of launching a nuclear weapon.
But Kiriakou drops a massive wrench into that narrative.
A huge one. He points out that the entire U.S. intelligence community, all 18 agencies, concluded unanimously that Iran does not possess a nuclear weapons program.
In two separate national intelligence estimates.
Unanimously.
Yeah. And the danger here lies in how policymakers manipulate the flow of intelligence.
What do you mean?
When leadership cherry picks foreign intelligence over the vetted conclusions of their own domestic agencies, they aren't making decisions based on actual threat assessments.
They're just retrofitting facts to justify a predetermined political decision.
Exactly. It effectively nullifies the entire purpose of funding a multi-billion-dollar intelligence apparatus if you just ignore them when they give you an inconvenient answer.
The source even references a 2003 fatwa issued in Iran declaring the development of nuclear weapons a sin.
Right, under Islamic law.
But I have to push back here. Wait, we're told this is a fanatical regime. Can we really take a religious edict at face value when it comes to nuclear weapons?
What's fascinating here is that your skepticism is entirely warranted. And Kiriakou highlights it to expose a glaring paradox in Western political messaging.
Which is,
Well, policymakers portray the regime as a fanatical theocracy, rigidly bound by fundamentalist religious law, right? That's how they justify fearing them.
right.
But simultaneously, those same policymakers dismiss the regime's highest religious edicts when those edicts contradict the case for a preemptive strike.
Oh, wow. So it's a rhetorical shell game.
Exactly. Used to maintain a constant state of escalation.
And that rhetoric extends to the physical threat, too. I mean, you constantly hear claims on cable news about Iranian ICBMs potentially reaching Miami or New York.
But Kiriakou breaks down the actual physics of those missile tests, and he calls the threat pure smoke and mirrors.
Because Iran did manage to glide 2 missiles as far as Diego Garcia, right?
Yeah, but to achieve that range, they had to completely gut the missiles.
No payload, no heavy instrumentation.
Just an empty shell and an engine. If you load those same missiles with actual explosives, let alone a dense nuclear core, their maximum range barely reaches Cyprus.
So they pose zero direct existential threat to the United States mainland.
Right, and if we accept the source's premise that the nuclear threat is a fabricated mirage, it forces us to reevaluate the actual objective of the conflict.
The logical, albeit unspoken, conclusion is regime change.
The goal isn't disarmament, it's the total overthrow of the current government.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If you manage to topple a government ruling 93 million people who is sitting on the bench waiting to take over.
That is the big question.
Based on this interview, the U.S. proxy strategy resembles a surreal reality TV casting call. They're trying to cast a bad reality show to run a massive country, completely ignoring the local audience.
Because they fundamentally misunderstand the internal power structure. Kiriakou quotes Hillary Clinton acknowledging that Iran operates less like a pure theocracy and more like a military dictatorship under the IRGC.
And understanding that is critical, right?
It is, because bombing a heavily militarized nation the size of Western Europe doesn't trigger a sudden democratic awakening.
Historically, massive external bombardment triggers a fierce nationalist response.
Right. Those 93 million citizens, regardless of how they feel about their leaders in peacetime, are far more likely to rally around the IRGC to repel an external occupier
Than they are to welcome a foreign-installed puppet government.
Yeah.
Especially when you look at the candidates permanent Washington wants to install.
Yeah, let's talk about the MEK.
Kiriakou details the MEK, which he flatly describes as a quasi-Marxist cult.
A cult that in the 1970s was actively carrying out anti-American terrorism.
They literally attempted to assassinate a U.S. ambassador and a 3-star general.
Yet, by 2009, they are suddenly wiped from the terror list and paraded around Washington.
How does a group with American blood on its hands get rebranded as a pro-democracy proxy?
It's a masterclass in the cynical mechanics of D.C. lobbying. The MEK hired high-profile political figures across the spectrum, people like Rudy Giuliani and Howard Dean, to essentially sanitize their history.
That is wild.
The bureaucracy is remarkably adept at absorbing and rebranding former enemies if they offer a convenient, off-the-shelf counterweight to a current adversary.
So morality is totally irrelevant. It is purely transactional.
Exactly. And the alternative proxy option isn't much better.
You mean Reza Pahlavi, the son of the deposed Shah.
Right. He has lived in the United States for 47 years. The source paints him as a wealthy figurehead with absolutely zero organic support inside Iran.
His political backing comes almost exclusively from the exile community in Beverly Hills and specific Israeli factions.
Factions that are nostalgic for the diplomatic ties they enjoyed under his father's authoritarian rule.
Relying on disconnected exiled figureheads reveals this persistent, almost willful historical blindness in American foreign policy.
It really does. Kiriakou brings up a chilling anecdote from 2003, right before the Iraq invasion.
Oh, with General Tommy Franks.
Yeah, where Franks casually projected that U.S. forces would be in Tehran by August.
It's the enduring, catastrophic hubris of assuming invading forces will be greeted as liberators.
Completely discounting the complex, deeply rooted nationalism of the target country.
Well, if the strategy relies on out-of-touch exiles and rebranded cults, you have to ask how the intelligence community maintains any actual leverage on the ground in these hostile regions.
And according to Kiriakou, that leverage is often purchased through incredibly dark moral compromises.
Let's go back to that Afghan poppy field I mentioned at the very beginning of the deep dive.
Right. The statistics surrounding Afghan heroin production offer a stark look at the consequences of shifting intelligence priorities.
Because under the Taliban in the year 2000, heroin poppy production was effectively driven to zero.
Yet, following the U.S. invasion, Afghanistan exploded into the world's premier narco state, producing 93% of the world's heroin.
Kiriakou recounts traveling to Helmand province as a senior Senate investigator and speaking directly with an Afghan farmer.
And what did the farmer say?
The farmer claimed the Americans explicitly allowed the massive poppy cultivation starting in 2001 as a direct trade-off for actionable intelligence on Arab ciders.
Wow.
Yeah. And when Kiriakou drafted a report on this and shared it with a contact at the DEA, he was told the report would be permanently buried.
Because the resulting heroin epidemic was primarily ravaging Iran and Russia.
Exactly. Weakening those specific societies was viewed by the intelligence community as a strategic win.
It exposes the brutal utilitarian calculus of intelligence work. The CIA's Crime and Narcotics Center is described by the source as a career graveyard.
Because they only care about fighting ideological boogeymen.
Right.
First communism, then Islamism, and now rival nation-states.
Right. Narcotics cartels, despite driving the fentanyl crisis that actually kills Americans daily, are viewed as secondary issues.
Or even treated as useful assets, like in Afghanistan, if they provide tactical leverage.
Yeah.
But I do want to challenge the narrative of intentional malice here for a second. Is it possible this wasn't some calculated, multi-generational 4D chess move to drug the populations of rival nations?
You mean, could it just be massive bureaucratic incompetence?
Yeah. You have an overstretched military in a highly complex war zone. Maybe looking the other way on poppy farming was just the path of least resistance to keep local warlords happy and prevent them from shooting at American troops.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that bureaucratic inertia is exactly the mechanism at play, and it's arguably more dangerous than intentional malice.
How so?
Organizations default to protecting their core legacy missions. If the entire incentive structure of permanent Washington rewards countering Russian or Iranian influence above all else, then any asset that furthers that goal is protected.
Regardless of the horrific collateral damage.
Exactly. Kiriakou points to a literal missed opportunity where he proposed cooperating with Russia on counter-narcotics and counter-terrorism.
He pitched it to the Russian ambassador at lunch, right?
Yeah, and the ambassador was entirely open to it. But Washington ignored the plea because institutional momentum required Russia to remain the monolithic enemy.
You cannot collaborate with the boogeyman, even to stop a mutual threat like global narcotics.
Right, and when the entire apparatus becomes this hyper-focused on foreign maneuvering, treating global narcotics as a strategic tool rather than a threat, the rot inevitably turns inward.
Which is where Kiriakou's interview shifts from foreign policy critique to a severe warning about domestic institutional decay.
This transition from an outward-facing intelligence gatherer to an inward-facing political actor is the most alarming theme in the source material.
When agencies operate for decades without external accountability, they eventually turn their tactics on their own citizens.
He uses a striking historical contrast to show how fast the culture deteriorated. In 1996, a CIA officer faced severe professional reprimands.
And lost a promotion.
Simply for having a Bob Dole campaign bumper sticker discreetly taped up in her cubicle.
The firewall between intelligence work and domestic politics was absolute.
But fast forward to recent election cycles, and you see 51 senior intelligence officers signing a highly publicized letter falsely claiming the Hunter Biden laptop was a Russian information operation.
The mechanism of intelligence was actively deployed to shape a domestic political narrative.
And when the firewall collapses so spectacularly, the agency's credibility collapses with it.
And that politicization directly compromises actual domestic security. Kiriakou details the resignation of Joe Kent from the National Counterterrorism Center.
Right. Kent alleged that critical investigations were deliberately shut down.
Investigations specifically looking into whether Iranian assets were linked to assassination attempts on Donald Trump and the targeting of conservative figures like Charlie Kirk on U.S. soil.
Think about the profound contradiction there. You have a foreign policy establishment heavily focused on confronting Iran overseas, pouring billions into countering their regional influence.
But simultaneously, they are allegedly stifling investigations into Iranian operations, targeting political candidates domestically.
It suggests an apparatus that is more interested in managing domestic political optics than neutralizing genuine security threats to the homeland.
It speaks to a massive systemic collapse in accountability.
Mm.
Kiriakou compares the current state of domestic protection, specifically the Secret Service, to the standards held during the Eisenhower and JFK eras.
The Sarah Jane Moore story.
Yeah, she was flagged by intelligence for sending threatening letters to the president. A Secret Service agent investigated, spoke with her, got her promise to behave, and closed the file.
And 2 weeks later, she fired a shot at the president.
But the fallout from that failure in the 1970s was immediate and sweeping. The agent was fired, and the upper echelons of the Secret Service were systematically purged.
Because the institution recognized that failure to act on a known threat required a total, uncompromising reset of leadership to restore public trust.
But today, we witness catastrophic, highly visible security breaches, and the leadership structure largely remains intact.
Shielded by bureaucratic inertia and partisan defensiveness.
Kiriakou himself ends the interview, noting he is currently seeking a pardon for his felony conviction, which he maintains was unlawful retaliation for blowing the whistle on covert torture programs.
And he observes that he finds the most resonance for his case among Magyar Republicans.
Because of a shared, growing belief that the constitutional guardrails have been completely dismantled by permanent Washington.
This raises an important question about power projection. Can a government sustain complex, multi-front foreign policies when its internal mechanisms are completely fractured by partisanship and a refusal to hold its own agencies accountable?
Right. If you refuse to protect your own leaders and refuse to fire administrators who oversee massive security failures, your foreign policy inevitably becomes just as chaotic.
Reactive and untethered from reality.
So what does this all mean? Why does tracking the internal dysfunction of the intelligence community matter to you listening to this deep dive?
Because the bandwidth of your government is finite.
Exactly. While billions of dollars, immense institutional focus, and vast military resources are diverted into unconsulted wars,
Funding exiled proxy groups in Beverly Hills,
and playing geopolitical games with global narcotics, massive domestic crises are treated as secondary annoyances.
the fentanyl epidemic hollowing out American communities is the direct, downstream result of an apparatus too busy chasing ideological boogeymen overseas to secure its own backyard.
To leave you with one final, profound thought, we need to look at the long-term economic consequences of this institutional hubris. Kiriakou briefly touches on the fact that Iran is now fully integrated into BRICS.
And nations like Kuwait and India are beginning to trade massive quantities of oil in Chinese yuan instead of U.S. dollars.
Which strikes directly at the heart of the petrodollar.
Precisely. American economic hegemony is inextricably linked to the dollar's unquestioned dominance in global energy markets.
So if the U.S. continues a pattern of unilateral military interventions that alienate its closest allies,
and simultaneously utilizes aggressive sanctions that drive adversaries into the arms of alternate financial systems built by Russia and China,
we may be witnessing the accidental dismantling of our own economic foundation.
you can build the sleekest, most technologically advanced control room in the world, but if you break the global financial system that powers it, the screens go dark.
Wow. It makes you wonder how long an empire can run on momentum alone when the people supposedly steering the ship are too busy fighting each other to look at the horizon.
It really does.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden mechanisms of policy. Keep questioning the consensus, and we'll see you next time.